What happens when the very foundation of your beliefs starts to crack? When the things that you were raised to accept without question suddenly don't make very much sense. Maybe you felt it. That moment when your gut just tells you something is off. But everything in you resists pulling the thread because you know if you do, the whole thing might unravel. I know that moment well. I was raised to believe certain things were absolute. Hell, sin, salvation. The idea that if you followed the rules, you were safe. And if you didn't, eternal torment was waiting. No room for debate, no space for doubt. And to be honest, I always had questions. But for a long time, I was afraid to ask them. I thought maybe I wasn't one of the chosen ones because I had these questions in the first place. And that fear kept me in line. It made me second guess my own thoughts. It made me wonder if I was broken for not being able to just believe, just have faith, like everyone else seemed to. But then life forced me to look closer. To be fair, it's not like the people around me knew what had happened. When they found out that I was sexually active, they didn't ask questions. They didn't wonder how I got there or if I was okay. They just categorized me. A sinner, a lost girl, someone they didn't want their kids hanging out with. And honestly, I needed someone to help me unravel it because at the time, even I didn't realize what had happened to me was an assault. I wasn't even conscious when it happened, but I didn't put that together until years later. And maybe I would have figured it out sooner if someone, anyone, had been curious instead of just writing me off. Maybe if someone had talked to me instead of talking about me, I wouldn't have spent so many years carrying guilt that was never mine to hold. That was the first crack. The moment that I saw how easily love could turn conditional, how quickly grace could be replaced with shame, and how when faith is built on rules instead of actual connection, people get left behind. Still, I didn't just walk away immediately, because what if they were right? That's how deep fear runs. It keeps you tethered to things that don't serve you. It makes you justify pain. It tells you the problem is you. And when you've been conditioned to believe that questioning equals rebellion, even your own intuition feels dangerous. But eventually, I had to ask, what kind of love operates through fear? Why would an all-powerful, all-knowing creator need threats to keep people in line? And if love is supposed to be unconditional, why did it come with so many conditions? I wasn't the only one asking. Right now, millions of people are in the middle of a spiritual reckoning. Church attendance is plummeting. The fastest growing religious group is none. But it's not because people have lost faith. It's because they're done with fear-based spirituality that keeps them small, ashamed, and afraid to think for themselves. At the same time, the loudest voices in religion seem more concerned with power than with actual connection to God. It's not just about personal belief anymore. It's politics. It's legislation. It's shaping entire systems. And the question is, are we willing to look at it for what it really is? Well, today our guest is Brian Recker. He's a former pastor who went through his own deep reckoning with faith. And he spent years unraveling harmful religious teachings, redefining spirituality outside of fear, and helping others reclaim their beliefs in a way that actually leads to freedom. So in this episode, you'll learn why the concept of hell might be more about control than truth, how fear-based faith blocks real spiritual growth, and what it actually means to reclaim your beliefs in a way that serves you. I'm fascinated by the mind-body connection, especially how our gut health affects everything, from our mood to our sleep. After years of trying a bunch of different approaches, I realized something really important. What works for one person might be completely wrong for another. And that's what makes Zoe so different from other nutrition companies. They've created the most scientifically advanced at-home gut test and build the world's largest microbiome database. So when they analyze your results, they're not just giving you generic advice. They're giving you insights specifically for your body that other companies just don't have the science to provide. Think about it. How many times have you tried a healthy diet that just didn't work for you? Or felt really confused by conflicting nutrition advice? Zoe cuts through all of that with hard science. Their approach is so effective that in their randomized controlled trial, participants were 4 times more likely to report better sleep and more energy. But what I appreciate the most is that they're fighting against all of the misleading nutrition information out there. When big food companies are paying influencers to promote ultra-processed foods as healthy, we need science, and I mean real science, not paid for science, more than ever. Go to Zoe.com and find out what Zoe membership could do for you. And because you listen to Mind Love, you can use the exclusive code MINDLOVE10 to get 10% off membership. As a Zoe member, you'll get an at-home test kit and personalized nutrition program to help you make smarter food choices that support your gut. That's ZOE.com. Use code MINDLOVE10 at checkout. Trust your gut, trust Zoe.
I think in that sense, it's a very human condition. I mean, I wake up every day and I can choose, and this is where like prayer and meditation is so helpful to help bring us back to that centered place of presence in the moment and with our neighbor, recognizing that, again, we're all connected, that there's a divinity in my neighbor. There is something in my neighbor that is too beautiful to die. And yet I can go through my day and just forget that sometimes. And you can take people for granted, and you can easily live into death-dealing systems that are not that are not aligned with the reality of our divinity and humanity. But to be aligned in that is, I think, what it means to enter into the mindset that Jesus was talking about when he talked about the kingdom of God, which is within us.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
Every purposeful path begins with a moment, like a realization that the story you were living wasn't the one that you were meant to tell. For you, what moment comes to mind?
Hell was a big one that I really did a deep dive into. I spent a few years really wrestling with this. That had been something that really bothered me since I was a kid, that, you know, there was so much cool stuff in Christianity. Jesus himself is such an amazing spiritual figure. You know, the parables that Jesus tells, like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, the moral wisdom of Jesus, like the golden rule, and the law of love, things like that were just like, I mean, I couldn't shake Jesus, but like the idea that everyone who wasn't a Christian was going to burn in hell just never sat right with me. But it felt like something that I had to believe. It was a package deal. Hell came with heaven. It came with Jesus. It was just a whole part of the Christian thing. For a while, I really didn't like to think about it. And even when I was a pastor, I didn't preach on hell ever. And you don't have to. It doesn't really come up a lot. That's not the main idea in the book. And you'd think for something so all-consuming, you know, if really like the majority of people who ever lived that are wrong or going there, like there should be more real estate maybe devoted to it. But I think, and I don't know that this was connected to the Trump thing or not, but I will say that when the moral discernment of evangelicalism, it became apparent to me that it was like just transparently empty, and they really lacked that discernment. I did have kind of this sense of what else have they been lying to me about? What else have I just been blindly sort of accepting? The blind accepting of conservatism was, I really was kind of politically thoughtless until Trump, in the sense that I was always told my whole life that to be a good person, to be a good Christian, really conservative ideals are like the right values. And, you know, I think Trump was helpful for me in that it caused me to actually say, I can't listen to people anymore. I have to study this out for myself and really think through, using my own moral intuition, what I think about some of this stuff. And so I think I started doing that with other things. And hell was maybe the first theological thing that I wrestled with in those first few years. I was getting much more interested in a lot of different justice issues, really becoming aware of my own privilege as a straight white person, and understanding some of the various systemic oppressions that existed, which was not something that was ever talked about or that I was really aware of until I kind of had a bit of an awakening. And for a while, though, I still was content to talk about those things and wrestle those things from within evangelicalism and try to like challenge people from within. And it really wasn't until 2020 that I reached kind of a breaking point where I realized I can't be a part of this anymore at all.
So when you had this awakening of your beliefs, What changed with how you view the Bible? Because you said that you still root your faith in Christianity, but what's different from what it was?
A lot. When it comes to the Bible specifically, evangelicals tend to believe in something called inerrancy, which means that there's just no mistakes in the Bible. The problem with that is the Bible. There's not a single scholar that is not, once you take out like the sense of like what dogma demands you believe, um, any critical Bible scholar is honest about the contradictions within the Bible. And so the Bible doesn't naturally lend itself to that belief. That's a belief that comes from dogma, not the data. And so I think that we respect the Bible best when we receive it for what it is, which is a messy, complicated book that's written over the course of 2,000 years by over 40 different authors, speaking multiple different languages, coming from multiple different cultural viewpoints. And the fact is that they're often in conversation with one another. They often are presenting differing viewpoints. And I think that one of the problems with any fundamentalist religion, and every religion has its fundamentalists. You know, somebody was just asking me why do Jews tend to be more progressive than Christians, if they have the same Old Testament. And I pointed out, well, first of all, Jews on the whole they do tend to be more comfortable with like mystery and ambiguity, but also there are fundamentalist Jewish people as well. There's fundamentalist Muslims, there's also progressive Muslims. Every religion tends to have its fundamentalists who are more concerned with dogma and boundaries and exclusion. And then also people that realize that the whole point is love, like where it brings you is love. And so for me, the Bible, I see a progression within the Bible. I see a move towards greater openness, towards greater mercy, towards greater love and inclusion. And I think we're meant to follow a spiritual trajectory within the Bible. That's maybe the simplest way to put it. I think that you could get a lot more complicated than that, but it's a journey. And so there are points in which the Bible depicts God in ways that I don't think accurately represent who God is. But ultimately, like one of the most in one of the last books of the Bible, the sort of most definitive statement we get is that God is love. And so I think that's where it really does take us.
I was just having a conversation with somebody on this topic of how difficult it is to hold the fundamentalist view, whatever your religion is, and also be moving up the map of consciousness. Because even when you are sharing what you believe is the truth and what you believe is in love, if it's to save the other person from hell, you can't really do that without a threat of fear. And so how can you hold fear and love at the same time?
Well, that kind of dogma, it actually twists the very meaning of love. When you believe in hell, the problem, a lot of problems with hell, but it is fundamentally alienating in the sense that if I think that I have the answers that are going to lead to heaven and you don't, so you're going to hell, then I can't really enter into a relationship of mutuality with you where like we can see some things eye to eye. I can receive from you, you can receive from me. Ultimately, I have to save you. I have to fix you. You can't really truly be a friend or a neighbor. You're a mission field, you're a project. You need to be fixed and changed and saved. And that is me loving you. Because if you are going to die and go to hell, then I could make you a sandwich. I could help you cross the street. I could give you a loan for $1,000. And if I don't ultimately, though, save your soul, like what good is any of that? What good is improving your material conditions? If, that's one reason like evangelicals tend to oppose a lot of like social welfare stuff. They'll often say, it's not the church's job to worry about that kind of stuff because, like, what good is it if we, cure poverty if all those people die and go to hell? Ultimately, there's nothing more important than that. And that then twists the meaning of love. Like, you could literally, like, this is why evangelicals will sometimes, not all of them will do this. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but they'll hand out like a gospel tract, like go soul winning. And you'll see there's ones that are like, they look like $100 bill. And you open it and it's not a $100 bill. It's got the gospel in it, right? And so like, aha, got you. You open it and it's like, this is the real valuable thing is this good news of Jesus Christ, right? And like, so homeless people will find this and like, what a cruel trick to like think that you're finding money and they're like passing it out to poor people. It's like, no, we're giving you the truly valuable thing. So this is true love is trying to save your soul. And this is why it can justify incredible cruelty. I mean, parents have disowned their queer children. They won't go to their gay weddings. They cut them out entirely. And they can call that love because they might say, I could go to your wedding, but like if I affirm your sin, that only leads to you going to hell, then I haven't really loved you. Actually, the more loving thing is for me to point out your sin and to refuse to assent to it, to try to provoke you towards repentance and change. And that's what true love is. And so it makes it impossible to enter into relationships with what I think is actually love, which is really mutuality and a refusal to see somebody as a project, but actually recognizing that we're all connected. We all have something to contribute. And that I don't just need to save you. I need to be saved by you, especially if you are different from me and have a different perspective than me. I need for that to encounter me and change me. And you can't enter into that when you're a fundamentalist.
One thing that changed for me was understanding the word sin. This was like a level of unraveling fear in my journey of figuring out what I believed. And when I found out that sin actually means to miss the mark, or the original Greek word means to miss the mark, suddenly all of this other understanding that I had learned from Eastern wisdom and my own path started to make more sense, because it's generally meaning out of alignment is how I view it. It's out of alignment. And if I'm going to be aligned, then I'm going to be aligned with love. And so what am I aligned with? If I'm no longer aligned with love, that to me is sin. So it's more like a separation. It's a separation from my divine nature, from my connection with God. How do you view sin? When it comes to grocery shopping and meal planning, I have this problem. Time. With work and everything else going on, just finding time to cook healthy meals almost seems impossible. And when someone says a meal is quick and easy, it usually isn't. But that'll change thanks to Hungry Root. It's the easiest way to eat healthy. And I mean actually easy. What I love about Hungry Root is they're actually fast meals. I go in phases. Sometimes I'm making these super fancy recipes, but then for 2 weeks straight, my family is getting the quick and easy meals. And that's when Hungry Root is a lifesaver. When they say their recipes take 15 minutes or less, they're not lying. Plus, they have amazing variety now. Hungry Root works like having your own personal shopper and nutritionist. They take care of the weekly grocery shopping on multiple levels, both meal plans and actual groceries. And they'll recommend healthy foods based on your taste and your health goals. The variety is awesome. Over 15,000 recipes, plus healthy groceries like smoothies, snacks, and ready-to-eat meals. And what's really cool is how their recommendations get smarter over time. They learn exactly what you like, which means less thinking for me. You're going to love Hungry Root as much as I do. Take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box. Plus, get a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/mindlove and use code mindlove. That's hungryroot.com/mindlove, code mindlove, to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/mindlove, code mindlove. I need to share something that just changed the way I run my own business. You know that moment when you're drowning in work and realize that you needed help on your team like yesterday? Been there, which is exactly why I started using Indeed. Look, I'm going to give it to you straight because I wish someone had told me this sooner. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. I used to waste so much time posting jobs everywhere, hoping the right person would somehow find me. But Indeed's sponsored jobs changed everything. Your post goes right to the top where the best candidates are actually looking. And sponsored jobs on Indeed get 45% more applications than regular posts. But here's the part that matters. They're actually qualified people. No more sorting through hundreds of random resumes. And the best part? You're not locked into anything. No monthly fees, no contracts. You just pay when it works. It's kind of wild, actually. In the time we've been talking, 23 people just got hired through Indeed. That's their real data, not just marketing fluff. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/mindlove. Just go to Indeed.com/mindlove right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/mindlove. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. How do you view sin?
Man, I really like what you just said. I do. I see it very similarly. It's definitely not just individual, moral actions like cussing, especially when they're not rooted in harm. I think so. Yeah, like you said, the word means missing the mark, and I like to think about that in a sense of like missing the whole point of life, which is loving connection. And when we're living, like you said, not in alignment with that, when we're Paul Tillich is a Christian theologian. He said sin is estrangement or alienation from, like you just said, from yourself, from your neighbor, and from the ground of being or God. And so living outside of that, and I think in that sense, it's a very human condition. I mean, I wake up every day and I can choose. And this is where like prayer and meditation is so helpful to help bring us back to that centered place of presence in the moment and with our neighbor, recognizing that, again, we're all connected, that there's a divinity in my neighbor. There is something in my neighbor that is too beautiful to die. And yet I can go through my day and just forget that sometimes. And you can take people for granted and you can easily live into death dealing systems that are not like taking again that are not aligned with the reality of our divinity and humanity. But to be aligned in that is, I think, what it means to enter into the mindset that Jesus was talking about when he talked about the kingdom of God, which is within us. And so, yeah, I really liked how you described that sense of alienation, which we is a battle like all day, every day. Like with my kids, sometimes I'm distracted and I can speak to them in a tone that is not in line with what life is all about. It's not leading me into greater levels of connection versus I can stop and I can pause and I can remember this person in front of me, the love that's there, and I can sort of turn myself on and like recognize that and bring myself into alignment with that. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of see sin as well.
If you could redefine faith in a way that aligns with your current beliefs, how would you describe it?
So, the classic formulation that you've probably heard if you're a Christian is that we're saved by grace through faith. Um, and for a little while, I wrestled with that. Like, do I still believe that? And I do, but I don't quite think about it the same way. For Christians, in kind of a Protestant, more conservative tradition, when they say you're saved by grace through faith, what they mean is that you're saved by believing the right set of doctrines. So faith means believing that Jesus was God and died on the cross for your sins, so that paid your sin debt, and that when you believe that by faith, then the debt of sin that you owe God is placed on Jesus's account, and therefore Jesus is punished so you don't have to be punished, so that you don't have to go to hell when you die. You, by grace, are saved. In other words, you didn't do any works. You just believe in Jesus's finished work, and you receive that by faith. And faith in that sense means believing those set of doctrines about Jesus's divinity and death, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't believe that. I don't believe in that model of the cross or of what Jesus did or what it means to have faith in Jesus. But rather, for me, the grace of Christianity that I think is one of the most beautiful doctrines, really, that the Christian faith offers is the idea that you don't have to do anything to be loved. Not anything at all. It's pure grace. You are born into belovedness. God is with you and always has been. Psalm 139 says that this knowledge is too wonderful for me. God is before us and behind us and places God's hand upon us from before our birth, that God has been with you and God's love has always been with you. The psalmist writes that if I ascend into heaven, God's there. If I descend into death, into Sheol, into the grave, then still your love is there with me. And so you can't get away from it. And in other words, you don't have to become a Christian to encounter the love of God. Grace for me is pure grace, unmerited favor. It means, in other words, God's favor, God's belovedness is on you right now. If you're listening to this, I believe that God loves you and has grace for you, is with you, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you accept it or not, whether you believe it or not. You don't have to do anything to include believe certain doctrines to be loved by God. That love is inescapable. That's grace. Faith for me is believing it, is knowing it, is tasting it, is being present with that love. is allowing my heart to believe that I'm loved, is reminding myself and others that I'm loved. It is faith is grabbing hold of that grace. But the salvation that I'm talking about in this sense of being saved by faith through grace is not the salvation of if you don't believe these right things about God, then you're going to die and go to hell. This isn't about punishment. This isn't about avoiding God's punishment. This is about enjoying God's love. This is about enjoying the beauty of being human. That's a gift for all of us that we get to be here in these bodies. And one of the things that I believe it means to be human is to be loved by God and to be connected to this whole big connected thing that we're a part of as spiritual beings. And so the faith is simply it's the opposite of sin, really. It's being connected instead of being alienated. It's coming into that place of presence with the love that's always there, but just remembering it, waking up to it, being aware of it, and wanting to walk in it and have it affect the way that I live and treat others. I want it to be my words and my actions. And so that's what it means to have that faith. It's just bringing the grace that's always there. God always loves me, but I'm not always aware of it. And so faith is letting myself be aware of it. And that's really what salvation is, because salvation for me is not about avoiding hell. It's about bringing heaven on earth. It's about experiencing God's love in the here and now, in myself and outwards to others. And yeah, you have to know that you're loved in order to love. You have to experience love and be in love. And that love flows through us and into others and into the world.
A Course in Miracles was very healing for me because I found, because of my upbringing in Christianity, I experienced some religious trauma through it. When I was sexually assaulted, I was sort of pushed aside in my church because I was sexually active and nobody really asked me questions. And so I had a lot of resentment towards my faith originally. So when I was going on a broader spiritual path, I found myself in this weird place of not being able to say certain terminologies. I couldn't even really say God. I had to say source or universe for me to feel any connection. And I realized that in being in that place, I was cutting myself off from something. And so I had to heal some of those wordings, and I had to be able to say God if I actually wanted to experience God, even if I was believing I was experiencing source or oneness or whatever it was. And so A Course in Miracles was a big step for me. And what I loved was the way that the book describes thinking with God. And I couldn't really understand what sin and willpower and free will and all of this, like, how did it all fit together? And what you just described there is what I understood through this. It's like, what does it mean to think with God? What does it mean to have your eyes or your mind fixed on God, and sort of filtering life through that, filtering my intuition through that, instead of just like, because people say trust your gut, but I'm sorry, if you've been following the wrong things, or if your heart's hardened, or if you're like you are in all these addictive patterns, then that voice that you're going to hear is not going to be your highest thought. It's not going to be aligned with your highest good or your purpose in this life. It's going to be aligned with whatever hit you need next to fill that addiction or to fill your ego or whatever it is. And so I love the idea of or fear. What is it that you're entangled in? And if you're entangled in God, your thoughts, your first instinct are going to be more aligned with God's will versus being entangled in the ego. Then your first instinct is going to be more from the ego self.
Yeah, I resonate with everything you said. I haven't read The Course in Miracles myself. I have read A Return to Love, which is Marianne Williamson's sort of exposition of it, which I really enjoyed. And so I like everything that I've kind of heard about it, but yeah, I've been I have a copy. It's just so thick, and I have other things that I've read, right? But I really did resonate with what you said about God. I think that for so many people, that is an issue because we received a vision of God that was a big punishing guy, basically. That's who God is. When people think of God, they have a hard time breaking with the image of like a big, angry guy on a throne up there, out there, far away from us. I don't know if I don't know if you were traumatized in the same way as I was. If you ever read a Chick tract, do you know what a Chick tract is?
No, but I'm curious.
Okay, so I already mentioned gospel tracts, like that $100 bill one, but you pass out these tracts to do evangelism. Chick was a guy, Jack Chick. He was a comic artist, and he wrote these comic book little tracts that you pass out, and they were frightening, like horrifying. And almost everyone followed the similar pattern. There were dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. But basically, there's a person and they're doing some sinful thing. They receive the gospel, they reject the gospel, they die, they stand before God. And at the end of almost every chick track, you've got these people cowering before this giant glowing guy on a throne who's just basically like, you're going to hell. And so then the track concludes by basically saying this doesn't have to be you. You know, you can get saved and go to heaven. But that was like my vision of God. The first time that I started picturing God was based on like those images in this gospel track, this big glowing guy on a throne that's basically like, get away from me. Like you're a sinner and you get away from me. And I think for a lot of people, that is the image when they hear God. It's hard to get away from, you know, and even, Jesus was quite innovative in bringing a God of love that was not defined by wrath and judgment, but rather by love. And Jesus used the word father, Abba, which is like a very loving term for father to talk about God. But that even for a lot of us, the idea of father has been this hyper masculine word. Jesus was almost trying to do something quite subversive with that, where he was using the word father, but when he would actually describe God, he was using very tender, nurturing concepts that almost sounded more like a mother. So it was almost like even not only using the word father, but then describing father in a new way to give us a new vision for what fatherhood could even be. But unfortunately, we kind of held on to the masculine image and left a lot of the new things that Jesus filled that image with, and really just held on to the idea that, yeah, God's definitely a big guy. I mean, he's a father. And so we have this authoritarian hierarchical vision of God, which the reason I think universe is maybe more appealing to people is we're all a part of the universe. We're all connected together. And I'm a part of the universe. You're a part of the universe. We know that like we're a part of this big connected thing. And it's not just this big angry guy. The problem with universe for me is you lose the personal element. Like a universe doesn't necessarily love you. It's kind of cold. And so I do like God still. While I think of God not as a big guy, but more like that big connected thing that we're all a part of. But one of the beautiful things about Christianity that I like is the concept of Trinity, where you have these different conceptions of God. And so you have not only like a father, which is like a distant source, but you also have a Holy Spirit that's inside of you. So God is with us and in us. Then you also have the Christ, which is the incarnate God. In other words, the God of creation, the God that takes flesh. So like every rock, every tree, like the incarnate world is glowing with the glory and grandeur of God. And so it kind of is a more comprehensive vision for God that is also very personal. So yeah, that's God is an interesting thing to talk about as well. And reclaiming that word, I don't think is that important if that is a difficult word, but I think it's a fun one to take back if you can.
For sure, because you realize that words unlock, it's a vibration. It unlocks more than just the sound. And so for me, realizing I had a blockage there, it wasn't just that I didn't want the word to be stolen from me. I wanted to see what was there, what else I could experience with my understanding of the creator, everything that is, the Tao, however you want to look at it. And something about universe helped me to see that as the divine matrix. What I've learned from Ram Dass, how he describes the Tao and all that is, that was also a key part in me understanding the role of God. But the Trinity is an interesting one because the word Trinity never actually appears in the Bible, and it was developed later by the early church rather than being explicitly stated in Scripture. How do you reconcile that?
So I don't know if I reconcile it as much as I'm pretty comfortable with mystery, and I don't like formulations. I'm pretty opposed to what's known as systematic theology. There's different kind of theological disciplines. Systematic theology is when you go through each category, like a theology of God, a theology of the cross, a theology of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and you kind of like formulate how each category works, and then it's supposed to all fit together into like one clean system. But the Bible doesn't do that ever. In fact, it really defies that. And when you do that, you end up flattening things to try to force things to fit. And so a lot of those initial formulations, like Christ's dual natures and the Trinity, I think that those conversations are really, really important. And I think that wrestling with, man, what does there are elements of like Christ's humanity and yet divinity in the Bible. What do we do with that? Let's wrestle with that. I love the conversation. I love the wrestle. What I don't love is when they have to decide, okay, this is exactly how it works. We figured it out. Here's the theological formulation. And if you depart from that, you're a heretic and, we'll probably kill you. That I didn't like. And they did that with the Trinity as well. And so, yeah, it's like, wow, the Bible seems to talk about Jesus like Jesus is God. The Bible talks about like this Father that's God, the God of Jesus. That doesn't make sense. And then the Holy Spirit is God, and Jesus is talking about the Holy Spirit and separate from the Father, which is also God. So, yeah, it never lays out a systematic approach. It doesn't formulate it for us. And that to me, though, I love the conversations of church history. So I don't ever want to be like, oh, like church history, they're just a bunch of dummies. They got it wrong because they just had these systems. I do think that we've often been in straitjackets because I think it's important to recognize that a lot of those formulations were enforced by violence too. And that like there wasn't a freedom of thought after some of these councils. It was like, hey, we came up with the decision. And if you don't abide by that decision, like you can see your way out. And there's, we've got some swords waiting for you. And so I don't think that's the best way to keep open like a conversation and curiosity. That being said, I think the Trinity has been for thousands of years. Christians have gotten a lot out of it. And I personally have, I think it's as good a way of talking about the mystery of God as any. I don't think there's any perfect way of talking about the mystery of God. One of my favorite descriptions of God, and I forget who said it, but he said that God is the name of the blanket that we throw over the mystery to give it a shape. In other words, whenever we're talking about God, we're talking about the things that can't really be named. And so we're just doing our best. And so if I look at the Trinity as like, this is like one way of like just doing our best, then I like the Trinity. But if we're saying like this is a formula and it's the way to talk about God, and if you're not talking about God this way, you're wrong, I don't like the Trinity. So I don't know if that makes sense, if that's helpful at all.
It does, but I think it's at the point of understanding, as we've been talking about, where I believe scripture is meant to unlock something in you, to change something in you. And I think that we don't get that depth of meaning when we are limiting it to literal. And so we lose a lot in biblical teachings or any ancient wisdom when we're just trying to take it surface value. We miss the whole spiritual transformation of it.
Yeah, I mean, people do the exact same thing with the divinity of Jesus. I mean, I think it's beautiful that it's never spelled out in a super clear way. It leaves room. Like Jesus could just announce that I'm God, and he just doesn't do that. He refuses to do that. But yet, if you now, as a Christian, talk about it in any kind of mysterious or non-dogmatic way, Christians will call you a heretic. It's like, wait, why can't we talk about it the same way that they talk about it in the Bible? Why do we need to be more clear than the Bible is? That doesn't make sense.
Oh, that's a good point. And there's other stories like you wrote about in your blog, how the flood is a brutal story that didn't really happen. So why is it in the Bible? Give us that example so that people might understand why things that may not have happened are in the Bible.
Yes. So that I wrote about that one as kind of a typical story where, because I argue mostly with conservative Christians, but occasionally I'll find myself confronted by like a pushy atheist who's just like, why would you believe any of this crap? There's so much like violence and horrible stuff in the Bible. Like this is all just throw it away, right? And listen, if you want to throw it away, that's fine. But I don't struggle with the fact that there's a lot in the Bible that I don't think accurately represents God. I think the flood is a good example of one of those stories that's pushing us forward in our consciousness. I think the Bible, I like to think about evolution a lot. Like we're all a part of this big evolving story of humanity and the universe. And in the Bible, we see that process. And so one of the things when I studied the flood story that's really interesting, and I don't have this data in front of me, so I might get some of the details wrong, but there were several other flood accounts in the ancient Near East that predate the flood, quite a few. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is the most famous one. The flood story is actually one of the older ones, written hundreds of years after several of these other flood stories. And in other words, most of the readers would have been somewhat familiar with some of these other epic flood stories. And it was almost like the ancient Hebrews were saying, well, here's our version of this classic myth. And so one of the things you can learn is, well, what do they do differently? What are they trying to say different about God in their story to contrast it from what other people were saying God was like? And one of the main things is that in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in several of the other, I think the Babylonian flood account, I forget what it's called, but there's like a bunch of gods fighting. And the flood is this very arbitrary thing that's not based in kind of a covenant relationship with humanity. It is more about like infighting gods. Whereas in the flood story, you have a God who is grieved at the violence of humanity. And so God, while I certainly think that flooding humanity is a very weird thing to do if you're concerned about the violence of humanity, it's like, wait, so your response was to kill all of them? Like that doesn't make sense. But what they're doing is saying, like, this is a God who is concerned with who we're becoming and what's happening in the world and with people. And so God, in that story, wipes everybody out with a flood. But then on the other end of it, God seems to grieve again and says, I'm not going to do that anymore. And when God puts the rainbow in the sky for Noah, with the covenant for Noah, he says, I'm placing my bow in the sky. And that idea is the idea of like, I'm putting my bow and arrow, my war bow, I'm hanging it up. In other words, I don't need this weapon of violence anymore. That rainbow is supposed to symbolize essentially God's his warring weapon. And it's like, I don't need that. That was not the best approach. Okay, the violence in the world is a problem, but God does a growth in that story where on the other end of it, God's basically saying wiping out humanity is not the solution to violence. I'm going to put the war bow away. So I don't think that actually happened, but I think this is a mythological story where they're saying something about God, that God is not a violent, capricious God who's going to wipe out humanity. And so I don't think that every time the God character in the Bible does something that we need to put that in our theology of God and say that's what God is like. Actually, sometimes it's actually showing us what God is not like. And so I don't know that I believe God actually did that growth in real life. I think that we did that growth in our consciousness. We recognized that violence, that was not the way. And in that sense, we're able to say, oh, that's not who God is. And so our vision of God grew a little bit. When we move away from those capricious and violent images of God. So that's my best summary of that one without consulting my notes. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think the Bible does that over and over again. And I would say, like, when people like point out the genocide of the Canaanites, I don't think that God commanded genocide. I think that is evidence of, yes, when you are a tribal people, you often think God is on your side, and that justifies all kinds of atrocities. And we know that that's how religion works. But I don't believe that that's who God is. And we get other glimpses later on in the story that tell us that that's not who God is.
I'm reminded of, I recently interviewed or a former priest, sort of still a priest, Sean O'Leary, but he wrote a book called Setting God Free from the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Minds. And so he makes the argument, you would love this book. He actually goes through the entire Old Testament in the first half of his book. And like, he does it. He sets the stage in a way like it's a court case, like people fighting for God and against God, but like bringing you to a conclusion. It's really a cool way to do it. But he basically makes the argument that you can see the mindset of humanity through the depiction of God in the Bible. And so that's why God is supposedly willing to do these atrocious things. That's the time they were living in. Those are the punishments they were used to being given. And so if that's how God is depicted back then, and we don't depict anything like that anymore, is it that God has evolved, or is it just that we are creating a caricature of God through our limiting understanding of what our brain can actually comprehend of the infinite?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you believe about God says a lot more about you than it says about God. Which is why, many theologians have said what you believe about God is the most important thing about you. And I used to push back against that because to me, that always made it sound like, oh, if you don't believe the right things about God, you're screwed, you're going to be punished, you're going to go to hell. I don't believe that anymore, but I do believe that what you believe about God is very important, because if you believe God is love, you think love is ultimate. If you think God is punishment, then you think punishment is ultimate. Like, you think your rigid dogmas are ultimate. Like, I do think that you become what you worship.
Mm. What do you think the church as an institution gets most right, and what do you think it gets most wrong?
I think that as people have deconstructed and left the church, we are lacking in many ways meaning and community. And the church does often provide meaning and community. I think there's a lot of issues with the way that it does those things. So I don't know that I could say that it gets those things exactly right, but I do know that it's as good as most things at providing those things. Like I haven't found a lot better, richer communities. The problem is there were so many boundaries. It's community with an asterisk. If you didn't fit this particular mold, then you couldn't be a part of it, right? Um, that being said, I think people do struggle to replicate the kind of meaning making and the community that they received in church once they've left at the church. Our society doesn't really provide that very well. Most people are pretty lonely. And so I do think that in our spiritual communities and just really in the world, we need to build those things. I do think that I talked before about how the evangelical church doesn't tend to center justice issues. On an individual level, though, churches tend to be very generous in their local communities. They do tend to be pouring into their communities with food banks and various, like most churches, if a person, behind on their electric bill or their rent or their water bill goes in, most churches have a benevolence thing and they try to help people with stuff like that. I hate that the church is often then filled with people who don't want our government to be better at providing those things because I think they like the fact that it has to go through them. Um, but I think the impulse for generosity is good. I would love to see churches, though, see themselves more as mutual aid societies for their members, where there was more of a sharing of resources like we see in the early church in the book of Acts, as well as community centers for community organizing. Because again, like we are all very individualistic in our society. We're all pretty cut off from one another. And a lot of us, we feel like our society's not doing the right thing, but we don't have the means to get, power together to make meaningful change. And I think the church could be more of that. I don't think many churches are doing that well. I do know some progressive churches that are doing that well. I guess it depends. Yeah, like there's so many different kinds of churches too. Like some churches do that kind of stuff really well. The conservative evangelical church does not do that well at all.
Have you had any spiritual encounters that have either confirmed or challenged your beliefs?
Yeah. So I had a pretty intense mystical experience where I would say it clarified rather than confirmed. It did clarify things and it did feel like I was going in the right direction. And at that point, I was pretty well into my deconstruction already, certainly. I I had already let go of, exclusionary sort of religion, but I just felt a very deep, it just brought it home to me. I felt very much connected to the earth, to every creature. I was walking around outside and I kind of felt the history of what I was a part of, that it was inside of me, that it was all part of one big connected thing. It's kind of like hard to even put into words because when you say it out loud, it all sounds kind of obvious and trite, but like I felt it very profoundly in my body during that time. And I also felt a real peace about death during that time because I was breathing air that I knew contained molecules that had like pieces of people that had been around centuries earlier. And I was thinking about the fact that I was the culmination of all the people that came before me. And I'm going to have people that come after me. And I'm going to go back, whether through my actual like biological, future, through my children, or whether through the dirt that I go into, like we're all a part of this forever. And in that moment, it felt very beautiful and clear and profound. And it felt like God to me that I was a part of that I was a part of God. Um, so that was really powerful. And one of the cool things that happened during that time, because none of that feels very specifically Christian, it just felt very true and very human and universal. But it did also, I kind of just saw like, yeah, Jesus was basically saying that same thing. Like it just seemed really clear to me that Jesus wasn't trying to like give us a new dogma, a new straitjacket, a new way of gatekeeping the divine and saying it's only through our way, but actually that Jesus was pushing us in this same direction towards universal connection. And after that was when I actually started blogging more consistently because I felt like compelled to write about how I see these spiritual principles that I think are pretty universal amongst, like you even see Bob talking about in his work, in his mystical work, which is like across religions. But I feel like there's not a lot of people really pressing into the ministry of Jesus and showing how we see all these similar themes. And so I started writing more about that after that experience.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
What keeps you not attached, but aligned with Christianity as the root of your faith, rather than going potentially more broad like Bob Peck did?
So Christianity is my mother tongue. I think there's a lot of beautiful spiritual truths out there, and there's been a lot of amazing spiritual teachers. I do think that we can often do more when we're anchored in one particular tradition. We can just go deeper, and we can speak to people in a specific language that is contextual, because we're just contextual people. We need context to make sense of things. So I think of Christianity a little bit as a language to talk about spirituality, and you can talk about it in different languages. But it's the language that I learned and that I know best. And so I could work hard to learn other languages, and that would be fine. And that would be totally a possible, meaningful direction to go down. But I don't know if it's laziness or if it's purpose or what, but I feel compelled to continue to go deeper in the tradition that I've already been in and stick with that language that I've been speaking. I've studied the Bible my whole life. And so I've enjoyed, I think, okay, there's a stubbornness too. I hate the fact that Christianity tends to be represented by some of the worst people. And I don't like that they get to define who Jesus is for people, because I think they're really misrepresenting Jesus. I won't say that they're not Christians. This is actually something I've been thinking about a lot, because, every time I go online and critique something that Christian nationalists are doing, whether it's banning trans people or whatever the case, a lot of people will come in and say, these are not true Christians. And I understand what they're saying. What they're saying is these people are not representing Jesus well. And I agree with that. But I think we have to acknowledge that actually, if you look at Christian history, a lot of bad things have been done in the name of Christianity, to include genocide and colonization and crusades and inquisitions, and all of that stuff is Christianity. I can't say well, those weren't real Christians, those weren't real Christians, those weren't real Christians. You'd have to do that with just about everybody. And so I am acknowledging that I'm a part of a tradition that has done a lot of bad shit. And there has been good shit along the way as well. But ultimately, I think that's all of us in humanity. All of us are a part of a long tradition of a lot of bad shit being done. For me, the reason I'm still a Christian is because I do think it would be a net good if Christians were better than they are. And so, in other words, there's already 2.5 billion Christians in the world. Unfortunately, many of them think that being a Christian means believing certain things about Jesus so that they can go to heaven instead of hell when they die. I don't think that's what Christianity is. I think Christianity is in following the way, the spirituality of Jesus, which leads us into deeper love. And I think if 2.5 billion people were imitating the spirituality of Jesus, leading them into deeper love, that would be a net positive for the world. And so I see my mission as speaking about Jesus from within the context of Christianity, because I want Christians to be better at imitating Jesus. And if in my lifetime, Christians were less focused on the afterlife and more focused on loving well in this life, and if I had any small piece to do with that, I would say that would be a life well spent. And so in some ways, I'm finding a lot of purpose and mission in trying to push on Christians to actually, let's represent Jesus better. And so, that's why I guess I'm still a Christian. I don't have to be. I'm not a Christian because I have to be, in order to avoid any kind of punishment, or because this spirituality is better than other spiritualities. But because I think it's a beautiful pathway. Following Jesus is a beautiful thing. Um, and yeah, I don't know. Does that answer that question? Does that make
It does.
sense? What do
And
you think about that?
I really appreciate it because I believe that there are many paths to God. And I believe that it would be impossible to find one story that moves everyone. We all have different life experiences. We all have different belief systems. We all have different traumas. And so different things are going to move each of us. And if we really believe that God is infinite, of course he would create he, she, I have a hard time genderizing God.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, God would create multiple paths to reach the most amount of people. Otherwise, you're limiting that energy. You're limiting. So I appreciate that you still, because so many people are like, well, now I'm understanding more about this. And so I'm going to they let go of too much, maybe. Whereas I also think that there's a lot of beauty in realizing you're probably going to move more people by keeping that title, by keeping your alignment to Christianity. Because the moment that you say, well, no, I had this awakening and now this is not it, then you're an adversary to a lot of people that might be on the brink of expanding their mind just a little bit for a deeper understanding. But when you say,
Right.
even when I'm recommending books, because I have a lot of people, since I talk about this a lot, people are like, well, what book do you recommend? And depending on where they are at will depend on if I recommend Marcus Borg, who still considers himself a Christian despite expanding his mindset about what Jesus was really teaching, versus Bart D. Ehrman, who started as a
Correct.
devout Christian and then through his understanding kind of gave it all up. And so I'm like, I even meet people where they are depending on which books I'm recommending to them.
That's it exactly. And I am speaking to people. And so that's it's the language I'm using this language still because of the context that I'm talking to. And I'm finding favor, and grace in that context. Like I'm finding that I'm helping people in that sense. And if I were to abandon that language and say, okay, I'm not a Christian anymore because I don't believe in these particular theological formulations in the way of historic Christianity, that to me is ceding too much, because I think that nobody gets to decide. Christians have always disagreed about this stuff. There's never been one official position on anything, actually. And why should I leave it to somebody else to determine whether I'm a Christian or not? So yeah, labels in some ways don't matter, but you're right. If somebody was going to read my book that's coming out, knowing that I'm a Christian might help. It might hurt. It might not. It'll make it not the right book for some people, but for other people, the people that I'm hoping to really help move past some of these particular images and ways of being, I think it's still a good idea. It's more than strategy, though. I mean, I'm also a Christian because I'm a part of a Christian community. That's another thing that makes me a Christian, is I'm a part of a church. And so I'm a part of a worshiping community of Christians. And so that's another way that you could define it. What you were saying, I was pulling up a quote from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. One of my favorite quotes, what you were just saying reminded me of, I'm just going to read it. He says, remain true to yourself, but move ever upward towards greater consciousness and greater love. At the summit, you will find yourself united with all those who from every direction have made the same ascent, for everything that rises must converge. And so I believe that as well, that, man, if you're growing in love, like whichever direction you're coming from, I ultimately do think we're going to the same place.
Yeah, I see hell as a place that we end up in our minds, and you can just see when people are living in hell. I know many people in my life that I don't even need a conversation with them to tell that they're still in hell. So I'm curious though, with your new more expansive understanding, what do you see in the afterlife?
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. Yeah, I don't. I know that it's not punishment. That doesn't make any sense. I think I think probably, if I'm honest, I believe that whatever happens to any of us happens to all of us. I don't know that I think that there's different things that happen to different people. I don't feel dogmatic about that. I think there could be more mystery than I'm aware of, but I think probably we're all headed to the same thing. And I know at the very least that we will all continue to be a part of the big connected thing that we're a part of right now in a different form. Um, I think where Christians struggle is it's been ingrained in us since we were very young to value the continuing of our specific individual personalities. And so that is a challenging thing to let go of the idea of will my specific personality continue and the specific personalities of my loved ones for me to encounter in some very individual, personal way. And I am quite agnostic about that. And that's really the most important question I think that people are asking is like, heaven, I do think that every image that we get in the Bible of heaven is very much a metaphor. I'm a universalist in the sense that I believe we will all return to love. I just don't know if that includes uh, a new version of my individual personality in some glorified state or not, or if that's just a metaphorical way of returning to the love of God. So yeah, I don't know that the Bible's clear about that or that I could be clear about that. What I do have is peace about it because I've been convinced of the love of God and that what we're a part of matters, what we're a part of right now matters. My connection to you, to the earth, to this whole thing matters, and it'll always matter, even if it changes. And I do trust in God, for lack of a better word. I have faith in the love of God that continues beyond death, whatever that looks like. I don't need to fear it. And so I think I'm at peace with that. And that was a little difficult at first when I started to wrestle with like, if there's no hell and what do I believe about heaven? And if I don't believe in these rigid dogmatic ways of thinking, I at first was very scared about the idea of my personality ending. If that's the case. And I don't know that that's the case. Again, I would say I'm agnostic about that. But I know that now I don't think it matters to me that much one way or the other. Um, I have a piece that I'll be a part of God regardless, whatever that looks like. Um, so I don't know. That's probably not the comforting answer that some people were maybe hoping for, but
I actually find it very comforting that finally someone is admitting that we don't know what the F is going on. Like so many people want to be so sure. My belief is I think we reincarnate until our soul is ready for oneness. And so that's why there's people that are at such different levels of this incarnation where some of them are damn near enlightened and other ones are, you can see hell written on their face. They probably have a few more lifetimes to go to have these realizations. And to me, that is one of the motivations to experience God and love as purely as possible is because it's the ascension of my consciousness. But do I know that for sure? No. I've taken a lot of
yeah, I think if anybody tells you they know for sure what happens when you die, they're selling something, man. They're not. And here's the reason I love what I was able. It's interesting because my releasing hell allowed me to release certainty about all of that because I realized that the only reason you needed certainty was because you certainly didn't want to fucking go there. And so there's a sense in which hell demands certainty because it's so extreme, so horrific. You have to have a manufactured certainty because there's no real certainty. Nobody really knows. Nobody actually knows. They're manufacturing certainty to protect themselves from the frightening idea that they might suffer in that way. But once you realize that this whole thing is not about avoiding punishment, it's about growing in love, then you are free not to know. And you're free to not say like, well, do I have to believe the right thing? Am I believing the right thing? What if I'm believing the wrong thing? Oh, well, it's okay because, hey, even if you're believing the wrong thing, you're not going to be punished for it, right? So maybe a better question is, are you believing the loving thing?
Yes.
And so that's where I go with it.
It's funny too. One of the things that I've said over the years is I can't imagine devoting my entire life to a system of faith without questioning as much as possible when oftentimes those systems of faith sort of demand that you don't question. But I'm like, everything else you question all around it to kind of figure out what you believe. And a lot of people don't even realize that their visualizations of hell come more from Dante's Inferno and a book called The Vision of Tundale that were like written in the 1100s. And people just think that they're in the Bible and they're actually not. And it's funny the amount of conversations I've had with people where I'm like, oh, that's not in your Bible. And they're like, wait, what? Like they don't realize.
Well, when I went deep on hell, I was really like, it was a mind fuck. I was like, how, like, are we not all, like, nobody wants to believe this. So, like, why are we all believing this if it's not even clear in scripture? Like, what are we doing here? And that really was, I mean, that was the first domino that kind of fell in my deconstruction. And I think it's a really essential one for people to take apart because it does keep people from even questioning the other parts of it because that really keeps the fear in place. And so that's why I wrote my book, actually, which comes out in October, which is called Hellbent, how a fear of hell holds Christians back from a spirituality of love, where I help people not only deconstruct hell, but everything that comes with it, because that really does corrupt, like I was talking about, it alienates us from our neighbors. It causes us to approach relationships all wrong. It causes us to approach God all wrong as a punisher rather than as love. It causes us to see ourselves wrong as like as worthy of going to hell from birth. And that gives us a twisted spirituality. So a lot of us don't even know how to throw away hell because we learned an entire spirituality based on that. And so the way we view ourselves, other people, and God is all rooted in that punishment framework. And so my hope with the book, which hopefully will be one that maybe you'll recommend to people as well. I do quote Marcus Borg a lot. He's one of my faves. Is to help people move past that grid of punishment and embrace a spirituality that is rooted in love. And it can be anchored within the Christian story, but it's not actually necessary to do that.
I find it interesting how so many people's deconstruction began with actually sitting with the idea of hell for a little bit longer than you have before. And it makes so much sense too if you actually think about like David Hawkins' map of consciousness. Hell is one of those low vibrational, or fear is one of those low vibrational energies, emotions. And so if you're sitting there and you're basing, and so much of your anchor for your faith is around this very fear-driven part of it, how much higher can you go at the same time? It's like you're always holding both at the same simultaneously.
Yeah, for me, it was so integral to my spirituality that it was hard to. I mean, I think that when I was honest with it, it was like my whole relationship with God in some ways was rooted in fear and guilt, really. I was also just guilty that I wasn't so I was a fundamentalist growing up. I actually becoming an evangelical was actually my first step of deconstruction, even before the hell thing. I grew up as a fundamentalist where evangelicals were seen as actually quite liberal. I went to Bob Jones University. My dad is an independent fundamental Baptist, King James only, fire and brimstone, not even any rock and roll music in the church because that was like liberal, like piano only, like super strict. And hell was so foundational for us. And we were always not only being told to be afraid of hell, but also being made to feel guilty that we weren't constantly trying to rescue other people from hell. And so that was really like our whole spirituality was not going to hell ourselves and trying to save everybody else. And I think that even though most people in most like more like, kind of contemporary evangelical churches, they're not talking about hell every Sunday, but it's still the story of God that they're receiving. And it is this very black and white thing where it's in the background. And as soon as you question it and say, hey, maybe that's not what it's about, the whole story doesn't make sense. And what they'll often say is, if there's no hell, then why does any of it matter? Why did Jesus die? What's the point of Jesus? Why even be a Christian if there's no hell? In other words, it's not about the positive spirituality that's coming from their walk with Jesus. It really is about avoiding this bad thing.
Well, you've given us so much to think about, and I love leaving one thing for my listeners to either sit with or do for the week to bring it all into their reality. What would you leave them with?
Man, it really just depends on where people are coming from. I would imagine most people listening to this are probably not dogmatic, fear-based, fundamentalist or evangelical Christians. Um, I wonder, I mean, maybe, you talked a little bit about like reclaiming God. I imagine quite a few people do have Christianity in their background. and maybe they're not sure what to do with it anymore. Maybe they left it, or maybe they're still in it, but they're just trying to figure out, can I still be a Christian and be open-hearted in the ways that I feel? Um, and I think just giving, yeah, I would give you a lot of permission to reclaim whatever you want to reclaim, and don't feel any pressure to reclaim anything, because it's not better to still say you're a Christian or to not still say you're a Christian. One of those is not morally superior to the other. One doesn't make you more spiritual than the other. That being said, I think that there could be more power in reclaiming some of those things than we've thought about. Like when you decided to hold on to God because it did in fact do something for you. I think you're glad that you get to keep. They didn't get to take that from you, and so I would just say, like, some of us have like let go of things not because those things couldn't possibly serve us, but because we've like kind of let the worst versions of Christians rob those things of us. And, you know, I would say that Jesus is so much bigger than most of the forms of Christianity than that we've encountered, that it would make me sad if Jesus was fully robbed from you. And not that you have to call yourself a follower of Jesus or even a Christian, but if your version of Jesus has been fully defined by, the worst kinds of Christians, I think it's just worth knowing that Jesus wasn't like that, and that there could still be something there worth reclaiming in a lot of these concepts. Don't let people steal them from you if you can still get something out of them. And so maybe that's worth considering, is like, what can I reclaim, and would there be joy in that?
That's a good one. I like to think of things as an activation. And when I decided that words can be activations, then I also decided that no one's ever going to take a word from me through connotation. I was just going to redefine them in whatever way is most helpful to me in my life and my path. So thank you so much for that. And for listeners that are interested in following along, I know you share so many good things on social media. Where can they find you online?
So my Instagram is at BE Recker, Recker. And my Substack, where I write just about weekly. And the majority of what I do is lately I've been writing meditations going through the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus, showing how he was pointing us towards a universalist, inclusive, liberative, connection-based, love-based spirituality. And so if that sounds interesting to you, kind of reclaiming some of that Jesus stuff, my Substack is called Beloved, and I believe the URL is brianrecker.substack.com. And so you could follow me there as well. And be on the lookout in October 2025, my book Hellbent comes out. And so that could be helpful for some of you trying to leave behind some fear-based, punishment-centered versions of Christianity.
All the links from this episode will be at mindlove.com/392. Your challenge for this week is to take a closer look at the story you've been living on, especially the ones you never chose, the ones handed to you, the ones you absorbed before you even knew to question them. Maybe it's the belief that you have to follow certain rules to be worthy of love. Maybe it's the idea that questioning is dangerous, or that if you don't believe the right thing, you're lost. Maybe it's a story about who you are based on someone else's judgment of you. Whatever it is, this week, I want you to put it under the microscope. Because if you don't examine the story that's running your life, you will keep playing it out, whether or not it serves you. That's why I created The Story Alchemist. And I swear, this tool feels like magic. This is an AI-powered tool that I created on my own. I bet you didn't know I was that much of a geek, or maybe you do. But this tool is going to help you rewrite a piece of your narrative, one that still shapes how you see yourself, even if you know deep down that it's not the full truth. So here's how it works. You're going to answer a few quick questions about your experience and how you want to feel, and my AI tool will craft a personalized reframe. It's a new, more empowering way to see this part of your story, and you'll walk away with a shift in perspective that helps you move forward with clarity and confidence. So it's not about pretending your past didn't happen, but it is about reclaiming your truth in a way that moves you forward. So this week, pick one belief you've been carrying that you never chose and run it through the Story Alchemist and see what shifts. You can find this free tool at mindlove.com/reframe. That's mindlove.com/reframe I'll give you some thought starters on this belief to run through the system. Maybe it's a religious belief that was drilled into you. Maybe it's an identity that someone else placed on you. Maybe it's an old fear that's been quietly shaping your life. So give it a try and let me know what comes up for you. Again, mindlove.com/reframe. I'm actually really giddy for you to try this because everyone that's tried it so far is like, oh my goodness, this feels like magic. And for those of you who feel called to share their story, this is a really great first step. And practicing this is going to give you this superpower throughout your life because when things happen, you're going to start experiencing them differently because your brain will start automatically reframing for you. And I'll leave it at that. And that's all for today. Find me on Instagram at mindlovemelissa. And thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.